Welcome to First Church, First Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Perkasie, Pennsylvania. We are continuing a study on Saturday mornings with the men of our church in the book. Currently, it's Wall of Misconception by Dr. Peter Lillback. And it's been a very challenging, but hopefully a very helpful book in enabling you to think through worldview issues, particularly as they apply to the United States government and whether the government is just a neutral observer, a secular government, uncommitted one way or the other to any sort of religious ideals, or whether it is necessarily founded upon religious ideals. And the question becomes, well, which religious commitments undergird it? And throughout the book, Dr. Lillback has been making the point that our government was originally founded on Judeo-Christian ideals and standards, and that is what has informed our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, decisions by our Supreme Court, affirming that we are a Christian nation, various statements and comments by presidents along the way, affirming as well that we are a Christian nation, that we need to follow the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and so forth. And we've seen that we also have the Pledge of Allegiance, which was amended to include the phrase under God, one nation under God, indivisible and with liberty and justice for all. So we have been self-consciously Christian, and the documents that have formed the foundation of our nation's history have been designed with Christian standards in mind, a recognition of the total depravity of man, the need for a government, and then a government with checks and balances that comes right out of a Presbyterian, historic Presbyterian forms of government, with a plurality of elders in the local church and higher courts going up from there, local, regional, and national. And so you can see that our government, in many respects, reflects the worldview of Christian faith. Now, we're going to get into that a little bit more. The issue that brought all this up before us, it was a posting of the Ten Commandments on the wall of a courthouse in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And Dr. Lillback was among those that argued that this was an appropriate expression of the nation's commitment to Judeo-Christian values. And he's writing to a pastor who responded to him and felt that this was an unhealthy intrusion of the church into the business of the state. And as well, it's the state imposing a religious code upon its people. And he felt that that was out of bounds. So thus, the book that's an answer to that. And we've made considerable progress, as you can tell by the number of pages. We're on page 151 this morning, where we're going to talk about how liberty, that is political liberty, economic liberty, liberty of worship, all these kinds of things, liberty must be coupled with moral character for the establishment and continuation of a free people in a free nation. So we're looking at the nexus between law and morality, and whether good laws are sufficient of themselves to produce a good nation, or whether the morality of the culture, the morality of the people is in any way influenced or influencing the laws of the land. So this dynamic between law and morality is something that we've come across, that we've heard in the past, that you cannot legislate morality. And so I think as we go along here, we'll see that that's very much the case. I was thinking of a way of introducing the topic here with some examples of how these kinds of things come together for us. And I was just reading this morning from my June 2025 edition of National Review. Where, as I'm recording this, it's May the 3rd, so they like to get ahead of the news quite a bit. But they got, as they often do, they'll have short snippets under a caption called The Week. And quite often it seems like the editor or editors take on different things that are happening in the course of our country's history, and they'll make their own comments and evaluations. It's kind of a moral analysis of things that are going on. And one of the topics that it considered was Trump trolling his opponents about seeking a third term. And you've probably seen him talk about that sort of thing, saying that this is possible, it's something I might do. And National Review thinks that, well, maybe all he's doing is trolling people and trying to keep them from looking at him as a lame duck president, and so keeping him vibrant and effective as a leader. But National Review is of the opinion that this is not something that he's able to do legally, although Trump says there's a way to do it. We'll see how that all works out. I think if he were to serve a third term, he would be, I think they said, 83 years of age. He seems to be awfully healthy at the moment, by God's grace. But what National Review said was that our nation is a nation of laws, and we ordinarily have a peaceful transition from one presidency to the next. And if Trump violates that by having a third term of his presidency, then they thought that this is a real problem. And they talk about the corrosive effect of this, both on his followers and on those who oppose him. They write towards the close of this, the American system of transitions of power rests not only on laws, but on mutual trust and, yes, norms. It is corrosive of those norms to encourage Trump's supporters to think that he might get around the rules and to stroke the fears of his opponents that he could discard them. So the National Review is kind of raising a red flag, again, or at least a yellow flag, a caution against Mr. Trump here and the kinds of trolling remarks that he's made on a third term. You could also think about the kinds of things he said about Greenland and Canada and that sort of thing, whether he's going to take over Canada or not. Is he actually going to do that? Well, I think he has a strategy in mind. If you read The Art of the Deal, which I think I did years ago when it came out, he pushes people by making an outrageous statement, gets them all flustered and coming to him, and they try to negotiate him off of that extreme position. And then through the negotiation process, he gets them to actually where he wanted to be in the end. And so with Canada, I was reading a Facebook post of a minister friend of mine. I won't use his name here, but he's not in the OPC, just so we clear that. But he was saying he was concerned about the kinds of things that Trump was saying about Canada and how it has influenced the Canadian elections from possibly electing a conservative leader to now having a liberal again in charge of the country. And what was the meaning of this? Well, you could say, well, politically, that was a failed case, and Trump really screwed things up. He could have had a conservative in there, but I think Trump would have been happier to have a conservative president there. He was almost actively campaigning for that. But at the same time, I wonder if he doesn't have kind of another play on this, that he's going to have them pursue the socialist agenda even further and push the country. It's kind of like making a business go out of business by allowing them to continue their poor practices and just screw up everywhere. and then eventually they get taken over by somebody who gets it on the cheap. So we'll see what happens. And I don't know that. The other side of it is he may want Canada to really, he doesn't want Canada being a part of America, the 51st state. Rather, he just wants them to boost up their military, control their border, and perhaps reduce the tariffs on American goods. So anyway, morals and law. What does the law require? And do we have leaders and people that abide by the law? I think we saw in the last administration that you had leadership that did not abide by the law, particularly the border crisis that we had. We're getting into that today. And the one thing that I'll say further in the way of biblical introduction is that Israel had the best laws possible. They had laws revealed by God personally and directly as God spoke from heaven and gave them his 10 commandments. Did the presence of those 10 commandments necessarily lead to an upright and moral people? Well, obviously, when you view the history of Israel, you had periods of time where the people were led by good leaders, godly leaders like David and Solomon for the most part. But you had a long history of corrupt leaders and corrupt people, so much so that God sent his prophets with what scholars describe as a covenant lawsuit against his people. The diatribes, the attacks on Israel given by the prophets, exposing their corruptions, their sin, how they've broken covenant with God. These were covenant lawsuits for violating the terms of God's covenant with his people. And so the culture quite often did not live up to the law that was before them. So merely, you could say, having good laws does not necessarily mean that the culture will be good. And so you need to be engaged in the culture, reforming and transforming the culture in such a way that you not only have good laws, but you have a good country. Well, let's pick up our reading on page 151 with Dr. Lilbeck and allow him to guide us along the way here. He writes, perhaps you remember the poignant words of Madame Roland, a heroine of the French Revolution and lover of liberty, who cried as she was led to the guillotine, "O liberty, how many crimes were committed in thy name?" Her words here underscore what I'm trying to say, namely, there is a worldview necessity for morality and religious concerns in our government. This is not to ask the state to do the mission work of the church. It is not to harness the government to teach the church's values. Rather, it is to recognize the truth of what our founders expressed. Our American form of government depends for its existence and health on values that emerge from the Judeo-Christian worldview. So as I think of the way I began a few moments ago, you have the state. The question is, will it be a state grounded on Judeo-Christian values or a state grounded on humanistic, man-centered values? And it seems like the history of our nation is that we've moved from a Judeo-Christian based government towards a more humanistic based government, a secular based government, which presents itself as neutral, but in fact is hostile to the Judeo-Christian base that it is seeking to replace. And the sooner we wake up to that and recognize that we have an alien religion at work within our country, undermining our government, undermining our laws and our Constitution, and seeking to replace it with a new set of values, the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we can arm ourselves and equip ourselves to do battle with that in every way, through worship services, through prayers, through transformation of our personal lives, through engagement with the culture at every element of the culture, at every level of the culture. So we need to be alerted to the fact that there are religious commitments that undergird every government system. Now, Paul, in the time of Rome, had a very pagan government system. And yet, nonetheless, he was able to recognize that God was still able to work through these governments. God even described the civil magistrate as a minister of God for our good. And so Paul recognized, and we can recognize as well, that the civil authority, even if based on a pagan religious foundation, may nonetheless do many good things in the pursuit of justice, peace, safety, prosperity, and so forth. But they do so, if you will, with, to use an old Van Tillian term, with borrowed capital. They borrow from the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian worldview. Basically, they borrow from the fact that they are made in the image of God, and God has imprinted his laws on their hearts and minds. They borrow from that, and they govern accordingly. So the image of God and the restraining work of the Spirit serve to protect the church, and we don't necessarily need a fully Christian base with a self-consciously Christian government. We don't necessarily need that. We can continue to serve. But Lilbeck's point, and mine would be as well, the nation would be far better suited if we had a Christian value system informing all of its judgments and decisions. So, continuing, several historical examples underscore this worldview necessity of Judeo-Christian virtues and for effective American government. The preamble of the Constitution highlights the quest for and value of several Judeo-Christian virtues: union, justice, peace, general welfare, blessings of liberty, and multi-generationism. Now, I'll just say at the start of this that these are values on the surface that most everyone would want in their government, in their community, and so forth. Who doesn't want unity, justice, peace, the general welfare, the blessings of liberty? Who doesn't want these values? So we could say, in one sense, they're not the sole possession of a Judeo-Christian world and life view. I would say that they properly belong to a Judeo-Christian world and life view, and that is the natural way in which those virtues grow and develop. The pagan system might borrow from them to a certain extent, but always in the service of man. And ultimately, man is the one who's in charge of things. And so those virtues come into play as long as they benefit the worldview that's at the core here. In any case, here's what the preamble of the Constitution says. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So their goal was to have these values as a part of the experience of the American states, the United States at the beginning. And to that end, they formed this particular government. So the government, the Constitution that defines the government, this government is motivated by these values that we have here, the domestic tranquility and so forth. Early founder William Penn said in his preface to The Frame of Government, quote, "Liberty without obedience is confusion, and obedience without liberty is slavery. Governments, like clocks, go from the motion men give them, as governments are made and moved by men. So by them they are ruined too. Wherefore governments rather depend upon men than men upon governments. Let men do good, and the government cannot be bad. If it will be ill, they will cure it. But if men be bad, let the government be never so good, they will endeavor to warp and spoil it to their turn. I know some say, let us have good laws, and no matter for the men that execute them. But let them consider that though good laws do well, good men do better. For good laws may want, or in other words, lack good men, and be abolished or invaded by ill men. But good men will never want or lack good laws, nor suffer ill ones. That, therefore, which makes a good constitution must keep it, namely, men of wisdom and virtue, qualities that because they descend not with worldly inheritances, must be carefully propagated by a virtuous education of youth. So William Penn saw that there was this connection between good government and good people. I'm reminded of what Benjamin Franklin said when he walked out of the convention and the woman asked him, what kind of government did we decide on? He said, you're getting a Republican government if you can keep it. It depends on the people themselves. I think we've seen that in recent years where many have been rising up against our government and trying to subvert it and undermine it. And then you have those who are in government who themselves were engaged in that subversion and supported in different ways, or at least turned their eyes away from the behaviors of those on the far left who were defacing statues, knocking down statues that bore the memory of our country's history, and things like that. Loback continues, James Madison, for example, declared at the Virginia Convention on June 20th, 1788, underscoring a view that we saw above in George Washington. This is Madison. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. It's a deceitful idea. Our second president, John Adams, underscored this belief in his address to the military dated October 11th, 1798. That's 10 years later. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. So when you undermine the culture, for example, by educating children in our public schools to adopt a relativistic value system, to look at life secularly as though there's no need for God to explain anything. Humanistic science can explain all that we need, and whatever else we can't explain, well, we'll figure that out as time goes on. This kind of faith in man, which has become the watchword of our school systems from the earliest moments up into our universities, is that which is systematically undermining the future of our nation. And I think it has already done its work dramatically in the course of our nation in the exchange of values from the historic Christian values that have informed the nation to the modern progressive value system, which is hostile to this Christian value system. So the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. And so therefore we need to guard our young people as they grow up, that they are taught consistently from the value system of the Judeo-Christian religion. Continuing, moreover, this early view was carried forward by our later presidents as well. President Harry S. Truman affirmed, quote, "The fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. The fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teachings we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we will finally end up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state." I think, in my humble opinion, that in the last few years, we were right on the edge of that totalitarian government, particularly when you had the COVID crisis and the country was in a lockdown and people were forbidden to go out of their homes or congregate in different places and so forth. And everybody had to stand 6 feet away and wear a mask and all this kind of stuff, which really had nothing to do with slowing the spread of the virus. There are many ways in which the state was showing its hand, showing its power over people and imposing itself. You have freedom only insofar as the government allows you to have that freedom. And when the government steps in, your freedom is over. Ask the truckers in Canada what they think about how they were treated in Canada. Talk about the preachers in Canada who were arrested, dragged off into prison because they dared to preach the gospel open air during the COVID crisis. You see how the government can try to flex its muscle and remind us who's in charge in different ways. And so totalitarianism is the denial of liberty. It's the enslavement of the people. And as we basically, sin is slavery. And as we give ourselves over to sin, to wickedness, we become enslaved by that wickedness. And totalitarianism is a kind of a response, a just judicial response to the corruption of people over time. Dwight D. Eisenhower said in 1957, "The blessings of life and the freedoms of all of us enjoy," let me start again. "The blessings of life and the freedoms all of us enjoy in this land today are based in no small measure on the 10 Commandments, which have been handed down to us by the religious teachers of the Jewish faith. These commandments of God provide endless opportunities for fruitful service, and they are a stronghold of moral purpose for men everywhere." That's Eisenhower after the Second World War. Remember, he was the unified commander of the Allied armies fighting against the Axis armies of Germany, Italy for a period of time, and Japan. He understood the pivotal role that moral values played in the freedom and success of a nation, perhaps better than many get to do. And he, in his mind, felt that the 10 Commandments were that which provides the moral foundation necessary for society to be at peace and to flourish throughout its history. Lilbeck writes, "While you may firmly believe that the government's supporting worldview is not needed for the church to do its work, let us remember that it is surely easier for the church to do its work from outside the catacombs than from within them." Remember, during the Roman Empire, early Christian communities fled persecution. They would meet down in the catacombs, caves underground where people were buried and that sort of thing. And that's where they would meet many times for their worship services in the catacombs so that they would avoid persecution for their faith. It's much easier to be able to go freely to the church down the corner and fellowship with God's people and not be concerned about police breaking down your doors about pastors and elders being arrested, people being imprisoned, their goods confiscated, and so forth. Which situation would you prefer? Which do you think would be more healthy for the growth of the church? Lobach continues, moreover, as I look at the eroding force of faith in the public square and the creeping hostility of the secularist worldview vis-a-vis the Christian worldview, there seems to me to be fewer and fewer avenues of promotion of the Christian faith in our culture. I was reading a little bit from a book a moment ago. I don't know if I can get it real quick here in front of me. This get the title page up here. This book is called Every Square Inch, An Introduction to Cultural Engagement for Christians, written by Bruce Riley Ashford. I take it he's a Southern Baptist. Apparently it was published by the Southern Baptist Seminary. And he has a chapter on politics and the public square. And he begins by saying, this is published in about 2015, so a little more recent than Lobach. As a Christian citizen of the United States, I get the distinct sense that I'm living in an increasingly post-Christian country. The majority of Americans no longer consider traditional Christian doctrines, for example, the doctrine of sin, or traditional Christian ethics, for example, biblical sexual morality, to be plausible in the modern world. Christians who do not abandon these beliefs are labeled intolerant and even hateful. It could go on with that, of course, but I think this is a feeling that perhaps you share as well, those of you who are committed to faith in Christ and seeing Christ as Lord over all. The title of that book relates to the claim of Abraham Kuyper that when Christ looks at this world, he says that every square inch belongs to him. So that is being contested in our culture today. Lobach continues, bottom of page 154, maybe 150 or if you're using the hardback copy. Because of this constant advance of secularist hostility to the Christian worldview, there is often an unthinking, unconscious acquiescence of all too many Christians to its faith tenet of the alleged neutrality of government. While the ancient church taught us all well that we do not need the government's support for our worldview to advance our faith, the ancient church taught this truth alongside of Tertullian's costly lesson. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So the expense of the church having a hostile government is martyrdom. Perhaps hundreds or thousands of believers being slaughtered by a hostile, bloodthirsty state. So then, Lobach continues, I do not desire the state to carry out the church's mission. However, I do not wish to give up a friendly home field playing advantage without a fight. For if we continue to lose ground as to where the Christian worldview is deemed acceptable by the prevailing cultural zeitgeist, it will not just be the government and the schools and the public square where the church will be silenced by governmental force, but it will also soon be in the church and in the home as well. Given that somber reality, I intend to stay engaged in the culture war in the public square before the forces of the state enter even further into my pulpit, either my pulpit or my living room. So if you teach your children at home to trust in Christ and follow him, you may have a visit from maybe a child welfare services officer who comes and wonders why you are teaching your children that it's wrong to be homosexual, that it's wrong to change their gender, and these kinds of things. You're oppressing your children and creating a problem, and then they might be taking your children away from you. That's not too outrageous a thought, unfortunately, today. So we need to recognize that we have to fight for our values in the public square. If we simply step back and allow the secular, pagan, man-centered worldview to take over the institutions of our nation, eventually they'll work their way into our church and our homes. You think of what took place in the old Soviet Union, in today's communist China, where Christian believers are intimidated, are compelled to be very careful about what they have to say. They have to sing hymns to Xi Jinping in China. They need to confess him as their ultimate leader. Just all kinds of things where especially if you become critical of anything that the state does, you can find yourself hauled off to prison. The state will not be content just to keep you out of government. It will hunt you down in your businesses, in your classrooms, in your home, and in your church. We have to know that this is a war that we're engaged in, spiritual war, and we need to be engaged in that war. Okay, what time? We still got a little bit of time. I'm going to try to finish this chapter for today. So we're on the fourth section now of the chapter, the concluding section. As Christians, we are to be salt and light in all of life, including culture and politics. We must rediscover the Christian's role of being what Jesus described as salt and light in Matthew 5:13 through 16. Salt preserves and purifies. Light dispels darkness. When we live out our Christian values, we preserve and purify our culture. We begin to dispel the darkness of injustice and ungodliness. Some have described the task of being salt and light as fulfilling the cultural mandate. The idea of the cultural mandate emerges from Genesis 1, verse 28, where we find the words, God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. We're all familiar with that cultural mandate, at least those of us within the Reformed community. It's a mandate that governs our cultural engagement. We are to bring all of life under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So Christianity is not just simply having to do with your prayer life, your times of devotions, your attendance at worship services. It also involves your engagement in business, economics, government, the arts, entertainment, and so forth. Christ is Lord of all. And we are fulfilling our cultural mandate when we advance a Christian culture throughout our world. The cultural mandate was given before the fall of Adam and Eve into sin. So it was given in a perfect environment where the environment was not burdened by sin and the curse of decay on the world. And yet, listen to the main verbs here of this cultural mandate. God wanted his people, there are two that I want to highlight here. He wanted his people to subdue the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, and so forth. Subduing implies resistance. Subduing implies effort to overcome. If you are subduing somebody, it's an enemy that you're trying to exercise control over. And so even in a perfect world, Adam and Eve are going to have to labor to bring the world into a greater order, to move it from a garden to a city. And that was going to take labor and work. how much more so in a fallen world where sin is active and people are given over to all kinds of wickedness? How much more energy is necessary, more effort is necessary to subdue a hostile world, subdue and rule over it. Still, I think, mandatory for the Christian people in all of their endeavors. Well-known Protestant theologian, pastor, and author Dr. James Kennedy writes, "What is the cultural mandate? We are to take all the potentialities of this world, all of its spheres and institutions, and bring them all to the glory of God. We are to use this world to the glory of God. We are to bring it and surrender it at the foot of the cross. In every aspect of the world, we are to bring glory to God, and this means in all of the institutions of the world." That means that our public schools should be oriented around the value of bringing glory to God. That shows you how far our public schools have drifted away from a Judeo-Christian value system. That would be anathema to say within a public school system, you are responsible to raise our children to the glory of God, the Judeo-Christian God, the Trinitarian God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This God you're accountable to, and you should seek to bring every aspect of your educational enterprise to conform to God's will and to glorify God in it. Same thing with regard to our government. Our leaders in office should be conducting themselves to glorify God. Business leaders, entertainment, every aspect of life is to be to the glory of God. How that would reorient everything and change everything in our culture. It seems like a mind-boggling effort to make. And I'm fairly confident in saying that we will not realize that in this life, but it should be something that we work towards. Ultimately, that will only come when Christ returns and establishes his eternal kingdom. Many years ago, J. Gresham Machen, who is a great Princeton theologian, New Testament theologian, and founder of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Machen was a remarkable individual, and you should get to know him. Perhaps if you haven't come across him, you should pick up his book, Christianity and Liberalism, and read through that. It'll be most eye-opening for you, I'm sure. Christianity and Liberalism by J. Gresham Machen. Machen said many years ago, Machen explained the importance of impacting one's culture for the sake of effectively communicating the Christian gospel. Quote, "It would be a great mistake to suppose that all men are equally well prepared to receive the gospel. But God usually exerts that power in connection with certain prior conditions of the human mind, and it should be ours to create, so far as we can, with the help of God, those favorable conditions for the reception of the gospel. False ideas are the greatest obstacle to the reception of the gospel. We may preach with all the fervor of a reformer, and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there, if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by ideas which prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion." Machen wrote that in an article called Christianity and Culture in the Princeton Theological Review back in 1913. Quite an interesting statement. We see that on the mission field. If you're sending missionaries to Central America or Africa or some other location where the culture is very backward, there are a number of things that you're going to be doing. You're going to be not only trying to teach the gospel to them, but you first got to learn their language and communicate that gospel in their language. You need to translate the Bible into their language. You need to perhaps help them put their language into alphabetical form so that they can develop literature and that sort of thing. You got to help them reform the government to provide for the peace of the missionary and others who come after him. There's just so much that needs to be done to enable the culture to rise up from its pagan roots, but also to be prepared to understand the gospel as it comes to them. Years ago, there was a missionary effort in probably Central America. In any case, they talked about the need for a key to a culture, some symbol, some idea that was prevalent within a culture, to use that in order to help them understand the message of the gospel. And this one particular culture that they were dealing with had a child that I think they would give over to another family or something like that. And they found this as a kind of key to the culture to introduce Christ as the one whom God the Father gave to us to bring about peace. So the peace child here was a key to showing something of God's work in Jesus Christ. Okay, as George Grant writes, cultural engagement or political involvement can never be an end in itself for a Christian. Grant writes, Christians should never become involved in political action if this is the limit of our vision. If our sights are set simply on enhancing or influencing or aggrandizing the present world system, then we should forget it altogether. True Christian cultural involvement action leads to rein the passions of men and curb the pattern of digression from God's rule. Those are those ideas of salt and light, a preservative and something which illumines, helps people to understand truth more and more. As Christians engage in economics, in law, in business, in the arts and entertainment and so forth, they inform people as to good standards and what's true and what's not true and so forth, and help to protect the culture from degrading further and further. But because the Christian has the truth of God, his calling is to impact all of life with his spiritual life. Francis Schaeffer put it this way. Schaeffer was a great apologist back in the 70s and 80s. He was known for his L'Abri Study Center in, I believe it was France. Maybe I'm wrong about that, or Switzerland. Okay. Francis Schaeffer, great Christian apologist, writes, true spirituality, and by the way, he has a book by that name. True spirituality covers all of reality. There are things the Bible tells us as absolutes, which are sinful, which do not conform to the character of God. But aside from these, the lordship of Christ covers all of life equally. Christianity is not just a series of truths, but truth about all of reality. And the holding to that truth intellectually brings forth not only certain personal results, but also governmental and legal results, end quote. I kind of wish that Schaeffer got beyond, well, I think he was attempting by moving from a series of truths to truth, a unifying concept of things. But get into the personal. We need to know God, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we don't understand truth until we know the one who is the truth, Jesus Christ. There's a personal aspect to truth if we wish to understand it properly. It's not just simply a factoid that's presented to us here and there. The point of all of this is to emphasize, Lebeck writes, emphasize that someone's worldview will control the public square. If we as Christians are not involved in the life of our culture, the Christian worldview will be unheard and will be the kind of salt that will only be trampled underfoot of men. since it has lost its saltiness. And that reminds us of Jesus's warning to his disciples. If the salt loses its saltiness, it just gets thrown out. So the worldview of our culture is important for us. First, perhaps the thing we need to do is help people to see that our culture has certain foundational commitments, and that our current culture is increasingly adopting a man-centered culture. And we need to understand the consequences of that commitment to a man-centered culture, how that has an impact on the way we live and how the country will go. And the more we systematically embrace a man-centered culture, the more our culture will decline and degrade into fathomless depths of immorality and corruption. Think of Robert Bork's book, Slouching Towards Gomorrah, that I think fitly describes the cultural consequences of a commitment to a man-centered society. We need a God-centered society based on God's revelation of himself and his word in Jesus Christ. And we need to build our culture, defend our culture from the false and deceptive claims of the humanist, scientist, educator, politician, and so on. Well, I hope that's helpful for you today. Next week, God willing, we'll pick up our next chapter, and we're slowly coming towards the end of our book. Next is chapter 9, George Washington's Constitutional Precedents for the Centrality of the Judeo-Christian Values in the Public Square. Be mindful that Dr. Lilbeck wrote a magnificent biography of George Washington as well. I always have a problem. Sacred Fire. I actually got it right this time. So consider joining us for that discussion next time. Please subscribe to our channel and join us for worship on Sunday morning at 9:30. Each Sunday we're in the Eastern Time Zone, Philadelphia area. We look forward to seeing you at some point. Come visit us as well in Perkasie on the corner of 5th and Ray Streets. We have a great church, and we will certainly give you a warm welcome. God bless and take care. Bye-bye.